Well, you feeling it now? You feeling pumped up a little bit? Night after night on the television screens, we saw those people in the streets. Amazing what was happening. And that kind of outreach and that kind of organizing doesn't happen overnight. And we've learned a little bit, I think, from what Jeremy has shared with us about that. How many students are in the crowd here tonight? Anybody? All right, stand up. Students, stand up. No? Young workers, young workers. Anybody from consider? Hey, there we are. Okay, it can be done. It can be done. I also want to acknowledge, before moving on, I just want to acknowledge Joel Davidson Harden. Joel, are you here, right? Joel has written a tremendous book, Quiet No More. And it covers the movements that we've just heard about, including the movement we're about to hear about in terms of the Chicago teachers. And so I just want you to know that his book is available if you wish to kind of probe a little deeper into some of the tactics and organizing that was done by the people you've heard this evening. Well, that brings us to the third dynamic speaker for this evening. We have across the river and to the west, moving from Detroit to Chicago, the Chicago Teachers Union, and the incredible work that they have done and the story that lies behind it. I'm not going to say anything more about it, but simply to welcome, please welcome, Matthew Luskin from the Chicago Teachers Union, an organizer with them.
Hi, how are you? So thank you so much for having me. Ken suggested that I start by giving a little bit of context to what we had been facing in Chicago and how the strike happened. And Canadians really relish when they get to tell an American, you know, you're from this little country that nobody knows anything about and people aren't familiar with. So I'll make sure that I get to do this. Our union, the Chicago Teachers Union, we're part of the American Federation of Teachers, one of two large national unions of teachers. We represent the teachers in the Chicago public schools along with clinicians, nurses, social workers, paraprofessionals, teachers, aides, clerks. You know, we're not quite wall to wall in the schools. There's a few other unions, but we're not strictly just teachers. Last year we went on strike for a 9-day strike. Roughly 25,000 of our members out on the picket lines across the city with mass mobilizations, and what was seen as a very political strike compared to what we're used to in the United States. Not that we're used to many strikes at all of any flavor, but much more so than most. But if the conversation tonight is about organized people versus organized money, let me give you a little context on what the organized money was doing in the city of Chicago at this time. So we were up against a massive corporate and political assault on the union, very public attacks on our members and public education across the board. U.S. public education is a system that, it's hundreds of billions of dollars across the country that there are many corporations that would love to get their hands on. But while privatization is a big part of the program, I want to be clear that that's not all of it. That while there are many corporations looking for ways to profit directly off the education system through privatization, there's an agenda that's broader than that. Part of it's about the busting of our unions and the impact we have on the political system. Part of it is actually not about profiting off of public education, but the massive defunding of public education, protecting low tax rates for billionaires and corporations. Part of it is about broad efforts to de-skill, deprofessionalize, and disaggregate employment in unionized sectors. Part of it is about, you really can't avoid race when talking about public education in the United States, especially the targeting of urban school districts for reform driven by billionaires across the country, and that's what we've seen. The impact of these corporate interventions into our school systems is overwhelmingly felt by students of color, parents in those communities, in low-income Black and Latino communities, and frankly, even the attacks on public employees. And we as a labor movement do not talk about this often enough, that an attack on public employees in the United States, especially in the urban centers, disproportionately means an attack on Black working class families, right? And that this is central to, you know, understanding what we were really up against. Our members had been facing these attacks for years, though, under our former king, or mayor, as they're sometimes called, Daley. Mayor Daley, you know, ran the city for almost 25 years, and during the, you know, not long before him, his father did for a similar length of time. And under this program, they began a system of reforms to the school system that they called Renaissance 2010. It was a program put together by a group called the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club of Chicago. They're every bit as evil as that name sounds. And you know, they put together a program of massive closings and privatizations exclusively in Black and Latino neighborhoods in the city. So during the period well before this strike happened, our city had already seen actions, school actions, either closings or privatizations at nearly 100 schools. In 1995, a law had passed that both dramatically reduced our collective bargaining rights, limiting the sets of issues that were permissive or mandatory subjects of bargaining. But it also, you know, directly intervened on the school system itself. There was a real loss of democracy, handing mayoral control to the Board of Education. Chicago is the only city in the state of Illinois that does not have an elected school board. It's appointed by the mayor. There were attacks on teacher quality, sort of a push for expansion of testing as a way to root out those evil, bad, lazy, greedy teachers. And there was a removal of funding from the system, both through cuts at the state level and funding for education and local schemes. We have a major program in Chicago. It appears in many cities across the United States, but really at a tremendous level in Chicago, called TIFs, tax increment financing. And this is property tax money that shows up on your, you know, bill for your home as going to the public education system, but it's been put aside. The purpose initially put into a fund for development in blighted communities. Well, over a third of the city of Chicago is covered in TIFs right now, and over 50% of this money is being spent in what we call the Loop. It's the downtown core of the city. There's a TIF district that covers LaSalle Street. LaSalle Street is the financials, it's the Wall Street of Chicago. It's the financial sector of the city of Chicago. Hardly anything you could call a blighted community. Roughly $500 million a year were going into these TIF funds. A tremendous amount of money, while at the same time, you know, gutting of public education is going on in the name of austerity and fiscal crisis. The impacts of these things, you know, are very concrete to our members. So it's the school closings and the losses of jobs, but it goes beyond that. I mean, communities destabilized as schools are closed, or schools go through multiple rounds of what they call a turnaround, where the entire staff is removed. The local school council, so the elected board of parents and teachers that are supposed to oversee principals, are removed, and a private sector manager is brought in. And then 2 years later, when that didn't improve, when it turned out that removing all of the people most invested in improving the school didn't improve the school, then they shut the school down for failure to perform. So, you know, entire neighborhoods that this impacts, you know, whether people stick around in the community. There was a loss in the city of Chicago in a 15-year period of 45% of the African-American teachers in the city of Chicago gone from the system in 15 years. We have overcrowded classrooms, special ed students don't get their services met consistently across the board. The ramp up of testing brought us to a point where right now, and if you're in the city of Chicago, students as young as preschoolers are subjected to mandatory standardized testing a minimum of 8 times a year. Illinois is number 49 out of 50 in the United States for per pupil student funding in education, and in our city, we still watch this TIF money flow out of the system while the Board of Education says there's nothing we can do about it. These things have only gotten worse. Over 150 schools in the city of Chicago without libraries. You know, it is now regular, if you're in a low-income community, that your school does not have an art teacher, does not have music, does not have any vocational programs left, no world language. And it's under these conditions that a reform leadership was elected within our union. A group of activists formed a reform caucus in the union. Frankly, when they were formed, it was not to be reformers running for office. They formed as an activist group fighting against school closings. They were the activist teachers that were doing campouts in front of closing schools alongside parents in protest. They had won a couple of battles, getting a couple of schools removed from the closing list. And eventually they decided it just wasn't tenable. Like they didn't have big electoral ambitions within the union, but that it wasn't tenable to continue this fight if the union itself didn't shift in this direction, and they ran for office. They were elected into leadership, and almost immediately after, Rahm Emanuel was elected as the mayor of the city of Chicago. Rahm Emanuel came in, and this entire agenda that I've been talking about was only ramped up. The mayor, one of his first statements upon winning the election, he was on the front page of the newspaper, and it was a close-up photo of him with the headline. We've got kind of a daily tabloid paper, this big blow-up picture with a gigantic headline that says, "Kids got the shaft while teachers got a raise." And that day, walking into schools, multiple members of our union just standing there sobbing. They were so just insulted and hurt, by how they felt about this. Which, lesson one right there, the notion that things get bad enough and that's what provokes people to organize just isn't the case. The reality is our membership was absolutely demoralized. A string of attacks came out. He instituted a new board of education. He appointed his new board of education, where we had spent years and years saying the board of education was doing the bidding of the businessmen and billionaires. This was no longer rhetoric. This is who he appointed to the board of education. Penny Pritzker, who Obama just made the Secretary of Commerce. She's the billionaire heir to the Hyatt fortune. Major funder of charter schools and school privatization across the country, has multiple private charter schools named after her. She becomes, a member of the Board of Education. David Vitale was the CEO of the Chicago Board of Trade. These are the characters who are now running our school system. In some ways it was useful. You can't really call us leftists for, accusing the billionaires of secretly running it when it's no longer a secret. An organization called Stand for Children was formed in the city. Just to give you some sense, they paint themselves as a grassroots parent organizing force to advocate for parent choice. The reality is, in a week and a half's time, they raised the better part of $1 million from 6 families in the city of Chicago. The Crowns, the Pritzkers, the Sam Zell, the wealthiest man in the city of Chicago and the owner of the right-wing Chicago Tribune newspaper. These are the folks who funded this program. The Board of Ed, our former leadership in the union, had left us with a contract that allowed the Board of Education to declare a financial emergency and cancel our raises. And so in the final year of our last contract, the 4% raise that was due to our membership was canceled and they received nothing. While at the same time, the launch of dozens of new charter schools happened across the city. And in what was maybe the most aggressive move within the schools, the mayor launched a program claiming that our members worked the shortest school day in the known galaxy. And that the school day had to be dramatically expanded with no pay for teachers. There's a notion under our contract, this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but I think just to give people a sense of the type of organizing that we were forced into out of this, was the mayor, in our contract we allow for individual schools to take waiver votes. Our members can vote a waiver to a provision of the union contract to allow some amount of local school autonomy. So if the teachers are willing to put in an extra 25 minutes a day in order to accommodate a different type of scheduling, if they want to move their lunch break to the end of the day so that they can teach longer class periods instead of shorter, things like this, our members routinely work these out with the school leadership and take a vote on it. The mayor announced a citywide campaign demanding that our members vote these at schools across the city. And this was the deal. The school day becomes longer. Your school receives $150,000 in funding if the teachers will vote for this. Parents, go demand that your teachers vote for this or else they must hate your kids. And these are at schools that, again, like I told you, many of them don't have a librarian. $150,000 is no small potatoes. It's actually, changes the content of the school for people. And so this effort to pit parents versus teachers, was extreme. In this environment, they moved a piece of legislation, supposedly about education reform, as it became clear that sort of the new militant leadership of our union was preparing for a fight on this. This legislation, it had effects such as gutting tenure and seniority rules within our schools, but it went much further than that. The same people who were attacking us endlessly about only caring about pay and benefits, once again limited our legal issues that we could ever strike over to only pay and benefits, right? In order to help make sure that we could not bring up broader social issues that, obviously matter not only to our members, but to parents and communities. And then in the most aggressive of the legislative moves, they attempted to completely outlaw strikes for our members. They were blocked from outlawing strikes, but what they did receive was legislation that they were convinced would win the exact same thing, would have the same impact. And this was legislation that said that in order for us to go on strike, we had to go through all kinds of hoops and cooling off periods and mediators, but that at the point of an actual strike authorization, 75% of our entire membership had to authorize it. They'd looked through the history books, knew that typically no union has turnout that high in most votes. Our union had never had that high a turnout. And so under these rules, if 70% of our members put a ballot in the box and voted 100% for a strike, they would not be able to legally strike. Of course, under these rules, no politician in the history of the city of Chicago ever could have been elected either. I'm gonna ruin the ending of the story for you. So the ending of the story is we blow these numbers away. We stopped counting the strike ballots at when we had broken 90% of our members having participated. Those who voted 98% yes. This is at a union that had no strike fund, that had gone, a generation since the last strike. It had been 25 years since our last strike. And at the end of the day, we lead a massive strike that is not only are there no scabs to speak of, but it enjoyed massive public support. That this was not a strike of our folks holding brief picket lines and watching it on the news, but in fact we had 20,000 person mobilizations nearly every day. That not only did we shut down downtown and take over bank buildings, but held massive canvases of communities doing outreach to parents and holding, continuing organizing. I'm ruining the ending because frankly the strike was the easy part, right? And it was the 2 years prior to it that made a real difference. At the end of the day, our union really isn't that special. What happened there would have been impossible 2 years earlier. We couldn't have won that strike vote 6 months earlier. Our members had been at a point where they were angry, but they were incredibly demoralized. They had very little faith that they could fight and could win. Tomorrow, there's going to be a session where we talk much more deeply about sort of the member organizing that went on, the rank and file activity. And we should be clear that what we're talking about here is not just a list of tactics that we applied, right? I mean, this was fundamentally 25,000 people in this union had to go through a real change in their understanding of what the union is capable of, what constitute union issues, what kind of power they potentially have, who their allies are, where these problems are coming from. And that was the heart of how we pulled this off. Today, though, I want to talk a little bit more about the sort of planning that went into it and the community organizing work that went alongside of it. Our union had no real organizing culture. And we knew that we were going to have to figure out a way to really talk strategy with our members to bring people onto this. Some of this planning came naturally. I mean, you really could predict a lot of what the employer was going to do and predict what some of the challenges were going to be within our own membership. We knew that we knew that the mayor and his billionaire friends were going to try to pit teachers versus parents and the union versus the community, and therefore we needed a much broader coalition. We needed allies, we needed movements. We knew that they would try to justify anything in the world by saying our hands are tied, it's the budget, it's the economy. And that the instinct of so many public employee unions is just to call them liars. And it's hard to get out of that because they are liars, right? But they're not just liars, they're not liars for fun, they're liars for profit. It's there's a reason why they've got this story about the economy, and we had to talk about the real reasons of the budget problems. At the end of the day, the school district does have financial problems. It's just not because the lunch lady can see a doctor, It's actually about a much bigger set of things. It was about what had happened with the banks. It was about what was happening with who leads the city. It was about the TIF funds. It was about these interest rate swaps, these rip-off deals that banks have with our school system. It was about a much bigger picture, and we knew we had to turn towards that and talk about it. We felt like that was taking the real offense. We knew that the mayor, he fancies himself a tough thinker, right? I mean, his whole shtick is to get out there and say, I'm the one who's ready to make tough decisions for the schools, the tough decisions that no one else will do. And we had to be in a position to say that deciding to close schools in African American communities, deciding to take resources from the communities that are most underfunded to begin with, that are least politically represented to begin with, that's actually the easy decision, right? The tough decision would be to say no to your golfing buddies. The tough decision would be to say no to the people you go to the opera with, right? So let's actually outreform the reformers and like put some real demands on the table, which really got to one of the discussions we had to talk about with our own members. The advice, many of our members were terrified of this fight, and rightfully so. And the advice coming, and this is being honest amongst all my closest friends in Windsor, the advice coming from every corner of the labor movement to a union that was led by, it was walking into the biggest labor struggle in the United States, but had until 2 years prior all been rank and file classroom teachers. Every corner of the labor movement was telling us, don't do this, be reasonable, you need a seat at the table. You will lose this strike, you cannot beat things like merit pay, the public will turn against you, you will set back the entire labor movement, right? This is the advice coming from our own national union, this is what's coming from the supposed allies around us. And we came to a different conclusion, which was if we know, and our members know, that this is not a fight about whether or not we get 4% raises, if the other side isn't just nibbling around the edges, if this is fundamentally about the big picture, if this is about the future of public education, if this is about whether good neighborhood schools will exist in black neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, we better say it. We better say it, we better just be honest about it. And we're gonna have to take that on. We knew there was a challenge that the union is viewed as being greedy or only caring about itself. But part of taking that on isn't just about calling the other side liars and really unions are great. I mean, we've also got this challenge that unions are often seen as this like secret club that you need a like secret decoder ring to know anything about what it works and it only cares about its members. And one of the reasons we're seen that way is we often act like a secret club where you need a secret decoder ring and like we only talk about fighting for our members and we tell everybody else it's good for you when we fight for our members. Like we were gonna have to really say, put it on the line that this was about the big stuff. For our members and the demoralization that they were facing, we were going to have to find ways to really show them that you could fight back and win. There was no way that an organizing department of 6 people, if we were pretending that organizers were responsible for mobilization, if we were like confusing those two things, we were going to have a problem. We needed thousands of people organized. We needed thousands of leaders who could move this. And that to get there, we were going to have to win any of this, we were going to have to take on real risk. We knew that the mayor, frankly, as much as we were convinced a strike was necessary, we also knew that the mayor wasn't necessarily afraid of a strike. I mean, his campaign slogan had practically been, the teachers are going to strike and I'm going to tell them, fuck you. It's like, he wasn't afraid of a strike in and of itself. What he was afraid of is if we figured out what to do with the free time when we were out, once we left work. And that was the threat we sort of had to create. This was going to mean that the strike would be about issues that potentially were illegal issues to strike over, which meant taking on real risk at the leadership, and that our leadership would only sustain that if there were real movements around them, of our rank and file and of the communities that we worked with, demanding that we kept going forward. And I say that, with like the greatest local union leadership in our country, right? But they were only going to go forward if there were people pushing them to keep going forward, and we had to be honest about that. So what did that mean for the strike itself and the contract campaign? I mean, it meant that we had to understand that our contract campaign shouldn't be understood as just a fight to achieve a collective bargaining agreement. That was a short-term goal of it, but that we actually had to position this as part of a much longer-term campaign. It was one battle in sort of the war to protect our union for education justice against racial disparities in the public education system. We had to blur the line between the fight against school closings and for resources for a better school day, our contract campaign and the budget cuts that were coming. That we had to prepare ourselves not just for a short-term contract fight, but a long-term fight against austerity and privatization, a long-term fight for racial equity in the city of Chicago. In community alliances, we were certainly had leaders who were learning a lot from other movements. Occupy was a huge inspiration to us. The Quebec students, honestly, people regularly would be like, They were dressed like zombies. I mean, we got to do that stuff. In fact, you know, we were learning from other movements in Chicago, the Republic Windows occupation, which people may know about, where, you know, factory workers took over a plant. It was a small group of workers, but the audaciousness of their demand, that when a crappy employer decided to shut down, leaving them with no pay, no severance, not paying them their owed back wages, they took over the factory and said, you know what, Bank of America, you pay us, right? I mean, it was a bold move, and then they won. It was really a learning lesson for us. In our community alliances, I think one of the ways that our approach to it really differed from how a lot of unions do this. I mean, frankly, saying that you need to have community alliances is not so controversial within the labor movement at this point. Yet often it's treated as this very transactional set of relationships, or fundamentally about solving a public relations problem. And I think this is one of the key differences in how we thought about these things. We didn't treat it as a PR problem. We may have public relations problems, but it's not the media coverage that's causing the destruction of Chicago public schools. It's a power problem. And frankly, our movement does not have enough power on its own to win this. That we had to be clear that the people who wanted to bust our union and the people who are not interested in spending a goddamn dime on educating African American and Latino students in the city of Chicago are the same people for the same reasons, and none of these, you know, struggles individually have the forces to win. So that was the heart of our coalition, was realizing that it wasn't about just a short-term transaction or that we needed help with our little fight here, but this was about a long-term alliance in solving a common problem. On the 5th day of the strike, at the point where even we were pretty convinced people would want our heads on a plate, a poll was done by a pollster who is not a friend of ours, and the poll came back showing 68% of Chicago public schools parents supporting the union in the strike, and only 11% opposing. There's a lot of evidence that the numbers were even better than that. When you got past this poll only captured registered voters, the numbers were even higher amongst African Americans and Latinos. What this poll actually told us is that the more inconvenienced you were by the strike, the more likely you were to support it, because you believed that this was a strike that was about your issues as well. These things didn't happen overnight, and they didn't happen out of clever slogans. It was intentional work for a long time. Some of the principles that we really learned out of this was that operating in real coalition means that it is a real coalition. We were the largest player, we had the most members, we had the most resources, you know, we were in the press every day, we had more political power than many of our allies, but we needed to be in a position where we didn't dominate, where we didn't veto everything, where everything didn't move forward only as long as we checked off on it. We had to be willing to lose debates, we had to be willing to learn from others, and we needed them to be willing to learn from us. And you know, there were times when we lost debates that, damn it, we should have won, we were right. But there were a bunch of times that we lost debates where we really came out of it much stronger. Immediately prior to the strike, there was a round of school closings, and real fights sprung up around the city at a time when our members' biggest fear about going out on strike was whether it was possible to win parent and public support. And during this round of school closing fights, people saw clear examples of parents fighting alongside us all across the city. Our coalition that we were meeting with, upon taking leadership in the union, we immediately formed a community advisory board that met with the leadership of the union on a regular basis and planned joint campaigns. And within this coalition, we had a real debate. The community organizations really wanted to take the school closing fight very directly to the mayor in a very personal way. They wanted to hold a march and vigil. They wanted to hold a silent march and then a vigil outside of his home. We thought this would be a debacle. I mean, we really thought that there was no way this would get covered as anything other than teachers' union protests against mayor's children to save their jobs. And didn't think that would help us out. And we just lost the debate, and we went ahead with it. A 500-person march happened where people wore stickers across their faces saying silenced and things like that, because we weren't being listened to by the unelected school board. Outside the mayor's house, a prayer vigil was held. The Chicago Tribune, the more conservative of the two papers, and by more conservative I mean really, really, really evil, they ran an editorial after this vigil that the gist of it was, I never thought there could be anything more inappropriate than holding a protest outside of someone's personal home. But then I looked at the faces of the people who were there and the communities who felt like the only way to demonstrate the havoc being brought to their neighborhoods was to bring it to the mayor's neighborhood. And the fact that we could even get that kind of a discussion happening publicly, much less in the right-wing newspaper, told us something. Had it not been for that event, I don't know that 2 weeks later, when the Board of Education rubber-stamped the mayor's proposal to close schools despite mass public opposition, the president of our union was brought on national television. And while internally we had always talked about race and amongst our allies, it was the first time she was really on national television talking about Chicago's apartheid school system. And it was a huge leap in our rhetoric, a huge leap in our confidence to sort of directly take on some of the driving factors of what was happening. And so we learned out of these coalitions by being willing to lose these debates. Another key thing, difference I think on how we've approached this and how many labor unions have is we don't conceive of these relationships between us and the community organizations as just a relationship at the top of the organizations. They're not based on the goodwill and chummy relationships of the union president and the executive director of some NGO. Despite the fact that these are some of our closest friends and there are those relationships at the top, we understood that these actually require deep membership investment. We have talked to our members about it, we have talked to them endlessly about the importance of it, and it's gone beyond that. Rank and file members join these community organizations. They show up at meetings representing both the union and the community group that they're involved in. They help those organizations grow by calling them in and connecting them to their parents. At the end of the day, community organizations that were most reluctant to join such a kind of militant union around these things, community organizations that might have contracts with the city and things like that, we had to win them over. And frankly, a speech from our leadership wasn't enough to prove that it was worth the risk that their organization was taking on. It was our members showing a deep dedication and belief in this. It was their rank and file members of these community organizations demanding that they get involved in school closing struggles that brought some of them with us. And these were crucial elements of building, a coalition that wasn't just there on paper and at press releases, but was really there when we needed it at the moment of the strike, at the moment of the school closing struggles. These also took a willingness for us to go on the offense, which meant that, and I want to say something here. Again, I feel like it's very common for unions that say we need to turn towards communities and social movements to want to grab onto this rhetoric of we have to show it's not just about us. We have to show that we're willing to not just demand raises for us. Let's not demand raises. Let's win something for the community, which strikes me exactly as the boss's argument, to say that these things are at odds with each other, to say that somehow it's like our members' pay or shot at getting to retire is what's keeping the community from getting these things. In fact, what we were trying to say is that it's both of these. That in fact a win on one of these areas can be a win for both, that we need to weaken the forces that are attacking both workers' rights and the broader educational demands of the community. We needed clarity again that these are complementary demands and that the solution is going to be more power, that the solution is going to be taxing the rich, that the solution is going to be democratic control in the community, that a victory on one front moves the movement forward. When we settled our contract, when we came to a tentative agreement and it went to a vote of the membership, probably the biggest voice within our union of opposing an ending to the strike was amongst some of our most radical activists who were afraid that we had not won enough on air conditioners in our schools for the summer, that we had not won enough on additional art teachers, that we had not been able to lower class sizes, and that the community organizations would feel sold out. I think the reality is this coalition had become deep enough that amongst our allies, it was actually quite clear to them they weren't supporting the strike because they thought it was a transaction that would win them an art teacher. They were supporting the strike because they understood that a loss for a teachers union that had adopted these politics would be a loss for an entire education justice movement in the city. It wasn't truly principled support in that way. So, just to give you a sense, what we did win, they were largely defensive victories. We limited the longer school day, we preserved tenure. We beat back merit pay that they had wanted to push through. We were able to force the degree to which standardized testing is on our members is what our evaluations are based on, down to the legal minimum. The mayor had wanted to remove all limits on class size. We were able to protect it, win new rights to protect special ed classroom resources. We won just cause and made it harder for our members to be terminated unfairly. We added parents to the class size investigation committees, and we also won about 500 additional staff in art and music classes. That said, but don't clap for that part, because really it's like they already laid off those 500 teachers. And most of these economic victories are very minimal. You know, I mean, the victories that truly mattered, and the overwhelming majority of our members and allies understand this, is that what we won was about what would happen next. That when we were bargaining over what kind of benefits our members would have if a school was closed down, it wasn't just about the payouts to our members. What we were fundamentally negotiating over is how expensive is it when you want to shut down half the schools in black neighborhoods in the city, right? We were bargaining a protection against that and had a way to really talk about it. So what we won out of the strike was a shift in those sets of forces in the city. What we won out of the strike was that when the mayor, immediately following the strike, attempted to close, and did close, more schools than had ever been closed in any city in the United States in its history. You know, when the mayor chose to inflict Hurricane Katrina on the city of Chicago, that tens of thousands of parents mobilized against it. That parents who are not anti-charter school for the first time were mobilizing against charter schools, not out of ideology, initially anyway, but out of a belief that, you know, expanding the charter schools and privatization while at the same time removing resources from communities most starved of them was a real problem. Student organizations that bubbled up and then started doing walkouts. School strikes happened amongst high school students on standardized testing days in support of the school closing campaign. A link that, frankly, we hadn't even had the confidence to sort of link those two sets of issues, and the high school students have been leading the way for us. The largest charter school chain in the state unionized. And while many of those charter school teachers, you know, they wouldn't say they love our union and they're not as militant or left or whatever as us, the strike fundamentally changed the temperature of the waters they were swimming in, right? The idea that a union wasn't just about pay and benefits, but was about pay and about benefits, but also about fighting for the resources we want, that we can advocate on immigrant rights and on education reforms, that, you know, that became a real thing that they could take on. That the split was not between teachers and parents has become clear, and in fact at this point it's quite sharp that the split in the city is between the mayor and his allies and the African American community and public education advocates. So we haven't won this, right? But the lay of the land has dramatically shifted, and I think that's the victory of the strike. New coalitions have popped up that are very exciting around community organizing, around corporate targeting on these campaigns, around progressive income taxes and other issues. But I also want to end by being very honest about this. There's real limitations to it all. Externally, there's been a big shift in the lay of the land for community organizations in the city of Chicago. The community groups that have made a decision to really fight, to take on huge new risks, to be willing to ally themselves with us and this broader coalition, it's really exciting. I mean, you know, we are sitting with community organizations who a couple years ago never would have had this discussion about launching an independent political organization, about running our own candidates in the city of Chicago. That said, you know, within the labor movement, this shift has been much smaller. It's quite frightening the degree to which, you know, labor union leadership, because of the risks involved, because of the risk of retaliation from the mayor, because of the fear that you can't get your members there, aren't willing to take this on. Our general experience is that it's a little bit different when you go a few layers down below the union leadership, that amongst, you know, rank and file workers in the city, there's been huge support during the strike. Support coalitions came up as ways for rank and file activists to become a part of it. But our ability to bring the union leaders along has been challenging, and it's something that we've got to grapple with. Internally, there's real challenges too. While we're very proud, and I think rightfully so, of the coalition we've built around public education, it hasn't gone far enough beyond the set of public education issues. That, you know, frankly, we are somewhat parochial still. While it's a wide range of issues around education, we're going to have to come to grips with the fact that absent a vibrant labor movement, absent other labor unions going out on strike and taking on the mayor and fighting this set of issues, we need other movements winning around us for any of this to be sustainable. We need victories around minimum wage and low wage worker struggles, around immigrant rights, around mass incarceration and criminalization of black youth, all of which are really bubbling up around us in the city, but we've failed to deeply engage enough in yet. We've got a challenge that we sometimes substitute community organizations kind of their official leadership for the actual communities. That the reality is, CTU does not represent the American working class. Most community groups are small and struggling to be able to represent their communities as well. And we're gonna have to figure out how our members can play a bigger role in helping organize the communities around them. And so these are some of the things we're facing. And I also wanna echo the question about electoral work. We're struggling with that. That we don't, we're trying to figure out a way to engage in electoral work in a way that's actually a manifestation of the movement that's been going on and not a retreat from that struggle to just sort of lesser evil voting, practices. So these are the challenges ahead. Thank you.